The courtroom smelled of beeswax and old paper, and something underneath the metallic tang of fear masquerading as justice. 80 bodies packed into a space meant for 40, their breath clouding the February cold that seeped through gaps in the Montana courthouse walls. Ethan Mercer stood before Judge Harrison's bench, fingers trembling around a pressed wildflower, so fragile it might crumble if he squeezed. The brown petals caught the morning light slanting through frosted windows, and for a moment the flower looked almost alive again, almost the way it had looked when Sarah picked it from the high meadow 3 summers before her death. Grace sat beside him, 7 years old, in the blue calico dress Rosa Chin had sewn, her hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles showed white. Her eyes tracked Raymond Blackwood across the aisle, the banker in his pressed wool suit and gold watch chain, his face arranged in the calm expression of a man who knew how to buy verdicts before the gavel fell. Raymond caught her staring and smiled, the kind of smile that promised consequences. Ethan's voice cracked when he tried to speak. "Your Honor, I need to say something that's not in any document." The judge's weathered face gave nothing away, 70 years of territorial law carved into the lines around his mouth. "My wife Sarah died 3 years ago. Childbirth. The baby didn't make it. Before she passed, she looked at me and said something I couldn't understand, not then. She said I'd be a father again, that I'd know by the wildflowers." The courtroom had gone silent, in the way a forest goes silent when something dangerous moves through the trees. Ethan held the flower higher, his hand steadying. "I thought she was delirious. Fever talking. But this child, my brother's child, who I didn't even know existed until a week ago, she picked this same flower. Didn't know what it meant. Didn't know my wife used to press these exact ones between pages of books to keep them." He set the flower on the judge's bench with the care of a man handling something holy. "I failed my brother. 15 years of pride and silence. He died thinking I chose land over family, thinking I didn't want him. I can't fix that now. Can't bring him back. Can't tell him I'm sorry." His throat closed around the next words, but he forced them out anyway. "But I can choose his daughter. Can raise her right. Can show her that family isn't just blood or paperwork or what some court says it has to be. It's who you'd ride through a blizzard for, who you'd fight a whole town for, who you choose every morning, even when choosing costs you everything you thought you wanted." The flower rested on the dark wood of the bench, a small brown thing that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow mattered more than all the legal documents stacked beside it. Ethan looked at Grace, saw his brother's eyes staring back, that particular shade of blue-gray that ran in the Mercer line, and understood what Sarah had seen in her fever dreams. "My wife was right. I'm a father, again, and I know it by the wildflowers." The screen went black. White text burned through the darkness, 6 weeks earlier, December 1884. The wind came first, the way it always did in Montana winter, a low moan that built to a shriek as it tore across the valley and rattled every loose board on the Mercer Ranch. December 20th, 8 o'clock, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset. Ethan Mercer rode through the gathering blizzard with his coat crusted white and his jaw set against the cold that bit through leather and wool like it had teeth. The town council meeting had run long, the way meetings did when men wanted to talk around a subject without ever naming it directly. They discussed property taxes and water rights and the need for a new school teacher, and all the while their eyes had slid toward Ethan, and away again, their mouths tight with the question they wouldn't ask. Why does a millionaire bachelor live alone in that big house? Unnatural, some say. Improper, Mrs. Hartwell had made her opinion clear without saying a word, the way women of her generation could. A lifted eyebrow, a glance at her husband, a small shake of her head that meant she'd already decided what kind of man Ethan was, and no amount of evidence would shift her judgment. 3 years since Sarah's death, and the town still whispered. 3 years since he'd carried his wife's body from the birthing room, while the midwife wept and the baby, his son, they'd learned too late, grew cold in the cradle they'd built together. The ranch gate materialized through the snow, iron bars, black against white, and Ethan swung down from his horse to work the frozen latch. The metal burned his palm even through his glove. Smoke poured from the chimney 100 yards off, thick and gray Elena's cooking fire, keeping the house warm enough that the windows glowed orange in the storm. 3 years of living in that warmth alone, and he'd almost convinced himself he preferred it that way. No one to disappoint, no one to lose, just the cattle and the land and the slow turn of seasons that asked nothing of him except endurance. He was reaching for the gate when he saw her. Small figure threadbare coat stumbling through drifts that came up to her waist. She hit the fence and went down hard, her body folding like something with broken strings. Ethan caught her before the snow could finish what the cold had started light, as kindling burning with fever that radiated through her wet clothes and into his hands. Her fingers clutched a torn scrap of paper, the edges frozen stiff. And when her eyes opened, they were fever bright and focused on nothing. The words came out barely louder than the wind. "I'm sick. I can't walk. Can I stay one night?" Ethan looked at his house, then at the storm building behind him. Walls of white advancing across the valley, visibility already down to 20 feet, temperature still dropping. Nowhere to take her. Not tonight. Not in this. By morning, he could ride her to Doc Hayes or to the church or to whoever in Coldwater might claim her. By morning, he could turn her over to people who knew what to do with lost children. But morning was 8 hours away, and her skin felt like coals through the wet fabric of her dress. He carried her inside. The warmth hit like a wall fire crackling in the stone hearth. Elkhead mounted above, watching with glass eyes that reflected the flames. Persian rugs that had cost more than most families earned in a year. His hands moved without thinking, coat stripped off, wet dress peeled away, wool blankets wrapped tight around a body so small it barely made a shape under the fabric. 3 years since Sarah died, and his hands still remembered the motions, how to care for someone fading, how to check for fever, how to tuck blankets so they trapped heat without smothering. Elena Torres appeared in the doorway, crossing herself the moment she saw the child. "Dios mío, that's the Blackwood girl." Ethan looked up from tucking the blankets. "You know her orphaned last June, living with her uncle." Elena's voice dropped to the tone women used when they knew something dark and couldn't prove it. "The banker." Ethan laid his palm on the child's forehead, hot, too hot, the kind of heat that came before delirium, or worse. The thermometer on the bedside table read 103 when he checked the mercury, climbing past the safe range into territory where bodies started making choices about whether to keep fighting. He sent Elena for chamomile tea and willow bark and anything else that might bring a fever down, then sat in the chair beside the bed and watched the small chest rise and fall in shallow, labored breaths. The torn paper had fallen from her hand. He picked it up, smoothing it against his knee. Surveyors, Mark's property lines, numbers that made no sense in the firelight. Names written in faded ink. Samuel Pritchard, Coldwater Settlement, Section 14. He set it on the table and stared at it. Something about the handwriting nagging at the back of his mind. But the storm rattled the shutters, and the fire popped, and the kettle began to whistle in the kitchen, and the thought slipped away. Steam and chamomile drifted through the doorway. Elena brought the cup on a tray, her rosary clicking softly at her waist. "She said something when I was taking off her boots." Ethan's hands stilled on the blanket edge. "What did she say?" Elena set the tray down, voice barely audible. "Said her papa told her you'd be warm." The words hit like cold water. Ethan stared at the child, auburn hair matted with sweat, face so pale it looked translucent in the lamplight, lips cracked from fever and cold. Her father knew him well enough to tell his daughter where to run when she was dying in a blizzard. But Ethan had never met a Blackwood, never done business with anyone by that name. Never Samuel Pritchard, the name on the surveyor's map. He reached for the paper again, studied the handwriting, rounder than his own younger, the letters formed with the careful precision of someone who'd learned penmanship from the same teacher who'd rapped Ethan's knuckles when his G's didn't loop correctly. 40 years ago, before their father died, before the will that left everything to the oldest son and nothing to the boy who'd trusted his brother to fight for him. Ethan's hands shook. He set the paper down and spooned tea between the girl's lips when she stirred, most of it dribbling onto the pillow but some going down her throat, working weakly. Her eyes opened, once pale blue-gray, fever bright, and found his face. "You look like someone. Can't remember who." Then she was gone again, drifting, her breath evening out. She started to hum, barely audible, a tune that made Ethan's spine go cold because he knew it. His mother's lullaby, the one she'd sung to him and Samuel 40 years ago, when they were boys and the world was simpler, and brothers didn't spend 15 years not speaking because pride mattered more than blood. He sat until the fire burned low, until Elena brought more wood and rebuilt the flame, until the child's fever dropped to 101 and her color stopped looking like winter itself. Sometime near dawn, he fell asleep in the chair, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion, And in his dreams, Sarah stood in a field of wildflowers and told him things he couldn't quite hear over the wind. Pale blue light filled the room when he woke. The child was sitting up eating oatmeal. Elena had brought the spoon, moving mechanically from bowl to mouth, like someone who'd learned not to waste food because waste brought consequences. Ethan straightened in the chair, his back screaming from the awkward angle. Morning. She looked at him, wary spoon halfway to her mouth. The bruise on her wrist caught the light purple-black, shaped wrong, the kind of mark that came from a hand gripping too hard or something worse. You're safe here. She nodded, took another bite. The spoon scraped the bowl's bottom ceramic on ceramic, a small domestic sound that filled the quiet in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. Outside, the storm had stopped. Just wine. Now, no snow, and through the window he could see the valley beginning to emerge from the white fence posts, like dark teeth, the barn roof sagging under the weight of fresh accumulation, the road to town buried under drifts that would take 3 days to clear. Boots on the porch, heavy, official. Ethan stood and walked to the front door, opening it before the knock came. Marshal Harding stood there, badge catching the weak morning light, face apologetic but firm, in the way of men who'd chosen law over friendship too many times to count. Ethan, Marshal. Got a warrant. Welfare check. He held up the paper county seal at the top, Raymond Blackwood's bank letterhead, across the bottom, complaint, filed yesterday claiming unlawful detention of a ward. The language was careful legal, the kind of phrasing that made everything sound reasonable even when it wasn't. Says you're holding a ward unlawfully. Ethan stepped aside. Let him in. Harding's spurs jingled as he walked tracked mud across the Persian rug Elena had cleaned just yesterday. The marshal looked toward the bedroom where the child sat, visible through the open door, spoon still in hand, her body going rigid the moment she saw the badge. She was dying in a blizzard. Ethan's voice came out flat. You want me to explain that to a judge? I'm not here to argue right or wrong. Harding's voice was low enough that the child couldn't hear. But Raymond's filed for a guardianship hearing. Judge Harrison arrives in 6 weeks. February 14th. He glanced at Ethan and something in his eyes said this conversation was happening off the record. Between us, Raymond's leaned on me before. More than once. Watch yourself. The clock chimed 7, brass and wood, in time marking itself with mechanical precision. 6 weeks. Ethan repeated the words in his head, calculating. 42 days to establish a right. He didn't have to protect a child who'd stumbled out of a blizzard and into his life like a ghost of something he couldn't name yet. Till Valentine's Day. Harding handed him the warrant paper, expensive bond stock, the kind Raymond used for official correspondence that was meant to intimidate as much as inform. You got till then to figure your position. Legal position, I mean. He left door closing soft behind him. Ethan stood holding the paper, feeling its weight, not the physical weight, which was nothing but the weight of what it represented. 6 weeks to prove he deserved a child who wasn't his by blood or law, or anything except the fact that she'd asked and he'd said yes. From the bedroom, the child's voice small and clear. Are you sending me back? He turned. She was standing now, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, eyes too old for 7 years. Children who'd seen too much always had eyes like that, ancient and exhausted and waiting for the next blow. Ethan folded the warrant, put it in his coat pocket. No, I ain't. The clock kept ticking. 6 weeks wasn't long. Sunday came cold, but clear. Ethan brought the child to church because that's what people did in Coldwater. Showed up, sat in pews, pretended community meant something more than gossip and judgment. She wore one of Elena's old dresses, hemmed up quick with uneven stitches, the fabric bunching at her waist but clean. They sat in the back pew, wood creaking under Ethan's weight, and she folded her hands in her lap like someone had taught her manners once, and she remembered even when everything else was chaos. The church smelled of beeswax and old wood and stale perfume from the town matrons who filled the front rows. Their hats bobbed like crow wings when they turned to stare, whispering behind gloved hands. Not quite enough. Ethan caught fragments. Bachelor improper, that poor child. What's he thinking? The child heard it too, her shoulders drawing up her body, going small the way prey animals did when predators circled. Father Sullivan stood at the altar, thin man with gray hair, and the tired eyes of someone who'd heard too many confessions and absolved too many sins to believe in easy redemption. He looked at Ethan once, then away. The service began, Latin prayers, responses, the congregation's voices rising and falling like wind through pines. The child didn't know the words, but she moved when others moved, stood when they stood, sat when they sat, a perfect mimic learning the patterns that might keep her safe. Then came the announcements. Raymond Blackwood rose from the third pew, banker suit, immaculate gold watch chain, catching the light from the stained glass windows. He turned to face the congregation, and his voice carried with the practiced smoothness of a man who sold trust for a living. Brothers and sisters, I must address a concern that weighs on my conscience. The whispering stopped. Everyone listened when Raymond spoke. He held too many mortgages, knew too many secrets, had too much power to ignore. A child my niece, orphaned and vulnerable, has been taken in by a man of means. Raymond's eyes swept the room, found Ethan held. Mr. Mercer's generosity is noted, but we must ask ourselves about propriety. A bachelor alone with a young girl. The child's hand found Ethan's small fingers cold. He folded his hand around hers and kept his face still, kept his breathing even, refused to give Raymond the reaction the banker was fishing for. The law exists to protect innocence. I have filed the necessary papers to ensure this child receives proper family care with her bloodkin, with those who have a rightful claim. 3 families in the pews ahead shifted, put space between themselves and Ethan's row. The message was clear: association carried risk, and risk wasn't worth whatever friendship or business they'd conducted before. Raymond sat down satisfied, and the organ began the next hymn. Ethan felt eyes on him, dozens of them, judgment without trial, verdict, without evidence. He didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there with the child's hand in his while the congregation sang about mercy and redemption and things they didn't mean. In the back corner, a woman watched Chinese seamstress Rosa Chin, her face unreadable behind the careful neutrality that immigrants learned to wear like armor. But when Ethan's eyes met hers, she nodded once, deliberate, and something in his chest loosened. After the service, Ethan walked the child out through the side door, avoided the front steps where Raymond stood, shaking hands and accepting sympathy for his burden. The ride home was quiet, the child staring at the road like it might hold answers if she looked hard enough. Why'd he say those things? Her voice was so small it almost got lost in the sound of hooves on frozen ground. Because he can. Ethan didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the road ahead. Are they true? Now he did look. Saw her face turned up toward his, 7 years old and already learning how lies worked, how people used words like weapons, how truth mattered less than who had the power to make their version stick. No, they ain't. 2 days later, Ethan stood in Raymond's office. The bank smelled of ink and cigar smoke, and old money, the particular scent of institutions that had stood long enough to believe they were permanent. Behind the marble counter, a clerk counted coins, the sound of metal on metal ringing thin in the high-ceilinged room. Raymond sat at his mahogany desk, papers spread neat leather chair. Everything in its place, a man who controlled his environment because control was the only currency that mattered. Mr. Mercer, good of you to come. Ethan removed his hat, stayed standing. Raymond opened a drawer, pulled out a stack of gold certificates, set them on the desk between them, crisp paper with government seals. The kind of money most men never saw except in dreams. $2,000. More than 2 months of ranch profits sitting there like it meant nothing. I'm a reasonable man. This situation is complicated. The girl needs family. Real family. Raymond slid a document across the desk, pre-signed relinquishment form, blank line waiting for Ethan's signature. Everything prepared in advance because Raymond had never doubted how this conversation would end. I'm prepared to compensate you for your trouble. Ethan stared at the money at the form at Raymond's face, arranged in the expression of a man making a generous offer. Behind the banker, the vault door stood half open, iron and thick, the tumblers clicking as someone inside adjusted the mechanism. Past Raymond's shoulder, Ethan could see the secretary, Miss Foster, Graybun 60, if she was a day, standing at the filing cabinet. Her hand shook. A pen slipped from her fingers, clattered to the floor. She didn't bend to pick it up, just stood there trembling, like a woman who'd seen too much and stayed silent too long. She's worth more than land to you. Raymond's smile didn't reach his eyes. Curious. Most men value assets over sentiment. I ain't most men. And she ain't an asset. The law sees bachelor guardianship as... Raymond paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who knew precision mattered in court. Inappropriate. Judge Harrison shares my concern. You'll lose the hearing, Mr. Mercer. This way, at least you profit from your charity. Ethan looked at the money again, at the zeros that could buy comfort or security or forgetting. He thought about the child's hand in his during the church service, about the way she'd asked if Raymond's words were true about the bruise on her wrist, shaped like fingers. No. Raymond's jaw tightened, the mask slipping for just a second before sliding back into place. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Maybe. But I'm making it. Ethan turned to leave, stopped at the door when Raymond spoke again. The law is already on my side. You know that. Ethan didn't turn around. Then I reckon I better get used to losing. He walked out. The bell above the door chimed bright, cheerful wrong for the moment. Outside, the January wind cut through his coat, and he mounted his horse with hands that had gone cold despite his gloves. Behind him, through the bank window, he saw Raymond pull out his pocket watch, open it, the gold case catching the light. Something engraved inside the cover, words Ethan couldn't read from this distance, but he saw Raymond's lips move, reading words someone had put there, words Raymond lived by. The watch snapped shut. Raymond looked up, saw Ethan watching, smiled. Ethan rode home through air so cold it burned his lungs. The sun was setting, turning the snow orange and gray, and the horse's breath came in white clouds that dissipated almost instantly. 40 days left until the hearing. 40 days to find something, anything that would let him keep a child who wasn't his by blood or law or anything except the fact that she'd asked and he'd said yes. That it turned out wasn't enough.
Dasan.
The general store smelled of burlap and coffee beans and lye soap. Ordinary smells that meant civilization commerce, the daily transactions that held a town together. Ethan was buying supplies when Rosa Chin appeared beside him, examining ribbon spools like she was deciding on a color, when really she was deciding whether to speak. Mr. Mercer. Her voice was low, careful, the tone of someone who'd learned that information could be dangerous depending on who heard it. I need to tell you what I seen. Before the fever. Ethan set down a can of peaches, waited. Behind them, Henry Cooper swept the store with slow, deliberate strokes, close enough to hear, but pretending not to listen the way small-town people did when they wanted plausible deniability. 3 weeks ago, she came to my shop, asked for thread to mend a torn dress. Rosa's fingers moved over the ribbons, still not meeting his eyes. When she reached for the high shelf, her sleeve pulled up. I saw marks. The store went quieter, just the sound of Henry's broom and the creak of floorboards settling in the cold. What kind of marks? Belt buckle patterns. Real specific when metal cuts skin. Now Rosa looked at him, and for the first time Ethan saw her wrist, a scar, old and white, shaped like a brand. And burns, cigar-shaped, on her arm. Her voice dropped even lower. That ain't fever, Mr. Mercer. Henry's broom stopped. He leaned on the handle, face troubled, older man, with kind eyes that had seen too much to stay naive. Children always say they fell. Rosa continued, her hand touching the scar on her wrist. I was 14 when a man burned me with a branding iron for spilling tea. Indentured. Took me 6 years to buy my freedom. I know what cruelty looks like, and I seen it on that child. Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides, fingernails digging into his palms, hard enough to hurt. The rage that rose in his chest was old and familiar. The same rage he'd felt watching his father give everything to one son and nothing to the other. The same rage that had driven Samuel away. The same rage he'd turned inward for 15 years because there was no one left to fight. You testified to that in court, yeah. Henry set his broom against the wall. Walk closer. Raymond holds a note on my store. $400 due in March. He looked at Ethan with the steady gaze of a man who'd already made his choice and was just stating facts. But my wife was friends with the girl's mother. Before the fire took. He paused, and something in his face said he was weighing his debts against his conscience and finding the balance tilted. Sometimes a man's got to choose between what he owes and what's right. Rosa touched the scar on her wrist again. Reminder, promise, warning. I'll testify when the time comes. Ethan paid for his supplies, coins on the counter ringing different now. Not just metal, but the weight of alliance of people choosing sides when choosing meant risk. Outside, the January sun was thin and cold, and he loaded the horse, thinking about belt buckles and cigar burns, and the kind of man who'd stand in church talking about propriety while his hands left marks that wouldn't heal clean. That evening, the child found him at his desk. The oak's surface was covered with papers, ranch ledgers, cattle counts, expenses tallied in neat columns that told the story of 3 years running a property alone. The green banker's lamp cast a circle of light that didn't quite reach the corners, and Ethan's eyes ached from hours of staring at numbers. "Can I watch?" He looked up. She stood in the doorway wearing a nightgown. Elena had altered her feet bare despite the cold, her hair still damp from the bath. Elena insisted on every night, because cleanliness mattered, routines mattered, normalcy mattered even when nothing was normal. "Ain't much to see, just numbers. Papa used to do numbers. Before bed. He said they told stories if you knew how to listen." Something in Ethan's chest tightened, a sharp pain that might have been grief or recognition or both. He pulled out the chair beside him. "Sit." She climbed up small enough that her feet didn't touch the floor and leaned close to study the handwriting. Her finger traced a line. "Stop. Why is this different?" She was pointing at an entry from years back, 1878. The ink darker because it had been written with a different pen, a different hand. Ethan had forgotten it was there, buried under years of more recent entries, a ghost transaction from a time when he'd still hoped his brother might come home. That's old business. But she was already reading aloud, slow and careful, sounding out the bigger words the way children did when they were learning that letters made sounds and sounds made meaning. Samuel Pritchard borrows $500 from Ethan Mercer for homestead purchase, cold water settlement payable in 5 years. Her finger stopped. She looked up at him, and in her face he saw the intelligence that came from surviving. Things children shouldn't have to survive, the quick mind. That learned patterns read danger, understood that information was currency. "Who's Samuel Pritchard?" The fire popped. Outside wind rattled the shutters. The clock ticked on the mantel, steady and relentless, marking time he didn't have. Ethan reached to close the ledger, and that's when he saw it between the pages, pressed flat and brown with age, a wildflower. The kind Sarah used to pick from the high meadow. The kind she'd pressed in books to save them, to remember, to mark moments she thought mattered. He closed the ledger before the child could see the leather cover settling with a soft sound that felt final. "That's old business, little one. Water under the bridge." She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the ledger, curious, already too smart for her own good. "You're teaching me ranch work. Does that mean I'm staying?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with hope and fear in equal measure. "You want to?" "I don't want to go back to Uncle Raymond's." The way she said it, flat matter-of-fact, like stating a weather report, made Ethan's throat close. No fear in her voice, because the fear had been buried so deep it didn't show anymore. That's what happened to children who learned early that showing fear made things worse. "You're staying." Her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, just enough to notice. "Until when? Long as you want." She slid off the chair, went to the door, stopped and turned back. "Mr. Mercer, yeah, thank you for the one night." And all the nights after. She left small footsteps down the hall, the door to her room closing soft. Ethan sat alone with the ledger, opened it again to the 1878 page, to the wildflower pressed between, to the handwriting that looked like his own, but wasn't quite round or younger, his brother's hand from 15 years ago, when they'd still been speaking, when Samuel had swallowed his pride long enough to ask for help, but not long enough to come home. He closed the ledger, put it away, but the question stayed, did he pay you back? Not in money, that had never mattered. The debt that remained was older, deeper, written in silence and pride, and years of not saying sorry when sorry might have saved them both. The message came at dusk 3 days later. Diego rode hard from town, his horse lathered despite the cold breath coming in white bursts that dissolved into the January air. Ethan was in the barn mending tack when he heard the hooves' urgent rhythm that meant trouble or news, and in cold water those two usually came together. Doc Hayes sent word, says come tonight, alone. About the girl. Diego's face was grim in the fading light, and he didn't dismount, just delivered the message and waited for Ethan's response like a man who'd learned not to ask questions when the answers might implicate him later. He say why? Just said you'd want to know before he dies. Ethan set down the saddle soap, wiped his hands on his pants. The leather smell clung to his fingers, oil and sweat, and the particular scent of work that kept a man's mind occupied when thinking became dangerous. He'd been avoiding thought for 3 days now, ever since the child had asked about Samuel Pritchard, and the name had lodged in his mind like a splinter working its way deeper. Tell Elena I'll be back late. He saddled a fresh horse, rode toward town through air so cold it made his teeth ache. The road was frozen ruts and patches of ice that reflected the rising moon half full bright enough to cast shadows, the kind of night that made distances deceptive and time feel elastic. Doc Hayes lived on the edge of Coldwater's small house set back from the main street. Medical books stacked on every surface like fortifications against ignorance. The place smelled of carbolic acid and old paper, and something underneath the sweet, sick smell of death coming slow. Doc answered the door himself, 68 years old, and bent with consumption, the cough that took him rattling deep in his chest. Blood spotted the handkerchief he pressed to his mouth, fresh and bright against the white cloth. "Ethan, come in." The fire was low, barely enough heat to take the edge off the cold. Doc settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose bones hurt, whose body had become an enemy he couldn't negotiate with anymore. Ethan stood hat in hand waiting. "I delivered that child." Doc's voice was rough, each word an effort. 7 years ago, December of '77, I knew both parents. Ethan's jaw tightened, something in his chest, going still the way prey animals went still, when they sensed predators but couldn't yet see them. "You asking me something?" "No. Telling you." Doc coughed again, harder, bent double with the force of it. When he pulled the handkerchief away, more blood spotted the cloth, darker, now thicker, the kind that meant the end was measured in weeks rather than months. Her mother died in childbirth. Hemorrhage. Nothing I could do. The father came to me after Hilda's daughter asked me one thing. The clock on the mantel ticked, brass mechanism marking seconds with mechanical precision, indifferent to human drama. Outside, wind pressed against the windows, and somewhere in town, a dog barked once, twice, then fell silent. "Asked me not to tell you." The words landed like stones in still water ripples, spreading outward in all directions. Ethan's hand tightened on his hat brim, knuckles going white. "Tell me what?" That he'd named her Grace May. That she had her grandmother's eyes. That he was sorry for 15 years of silence, but not sorry enough to come home. Doc's breath came ragged, each inhalation a visible effort. "Your brother Samuel changed his name to Pritchard when he left in 1870. Married a woman from Flathead Valley. That girl sleeping in your house, she's your niece." The room tilted. Ethan reached for the chair back, steadied himself against wood that felt too solid for a world that had just rearranged itself completely. Memories flooded back: his father's deathbed, the will read in a voice that brooked no argument. Samuel's face when he understood their father had chosen Ethan, had given everything to the oldest son, and left the younger with nothing but bitterness and the freedom to leave. "You let him do this," Samuel's voice across 15 years still sharp enough to cut. "You could have fought for me." And Ethan's response, the words that had ended everything. "It's his choice. Samuel is dead." Doc continued, each word deliberate, a man confessing sins before the ledger closed permanently. "Last June, wagon accident on the mountain road. Brakes failed coming down the grade. Some say worn cable. Some say it was cut." He looked up, eyes roomy but sharp, the intelligence that had made him a good doctor, still burning despite the body's betrayal. Raymond was appointed executor. Had the papers drawn up before the funeral. Ethan's voice came out rough, barely recognizable. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because Samuel asked me not to. Because men make mistakes and live with them and die with them, still unforgiven." Doc reached for the morphine bottle with shaking hands, the glass clinking against the table. "I'm telling you now because I got maybe 3 months. Can't take this to the grave. Can't let Raymond steal what's left of your brother's life." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to unsee once they'd been spoken. Ethan stood there, hat crushed in his hands while the clock ticked and the fire died lower, and Doc Hayes coughed blood into his handkerchief and waited for a response that wouldn't come. "She doesn't know." Doc's voice was gentler now, the physician offering what comfort he could. "No, Samuel never told her about you, thought he was protecting her from the family that didn't want him." I wanted Ethan stopped, couldn't finish, because what good were wants when measured against 15 years of silence, 15 years of pride, choosing itself over reconciliation. "I know, but wanting and doing are different things. Your brother left because you got the ranch, because your father chose you, because pride's a poison that kills slow." Doc coughed again, bent double, and when he straightened, his eyes were wet from pain or regret, or both. He loved that girl more than anything, taught her to read by lamplight, saved every penny for her future. And Raymond's been stealing it piece by piece since the day Samuel died. The clock struck 9, hollow sound that echoed in the small room. Doc's hands shook as he uncorked the morphine measuring drops into water with the precision of long practice. Go home. Think about what you're going to do. Because that hearing in February, Raymond knows. He's always known. And he's betting you won't find out in time. Oh, yeah. Ethan rode through darkness, the cold burning his lungs. But it didn't feel anything except the weight of 15 years pressing down like a gravestone. The horse knew the way home, following frozen ruts by instinct, while Ethan's mind replayed every moment the fight, the leaving the years of silence that had seemed like dignity at the time, but looked like cowardice now. He reached the ranch near midnight, didn't light lamps, just sat in the dark front room, still wearing his coat. The fire had died to embers, the house cold and getting colder, and he pulled the old letter from his desk drawer, the one he'd written in 1870 and never sent paper. Brittle, now yellowed his own handwriting from when he'd been 37 and his brother 22 and their father freshly dead. Samuel, I'm sorry. Come home. 4 words. He'd written 4 words and thought it was enough, thought his brother would understand what pride wouldn't let him say out loud, that the ranch should have been split, that their father had been wrong, that Ethan would have given half of it, would have given all of it if it meant keeping his brother. But he'd never sent it. Pride or fear or some mix of both, and Samuel had left, changed his name, built a life, had a daughter died on a mountain road with brakes that failed or were cut, and no one to ask questions because the banker held the papers. The 1878 ledger entry made sense now. Samuel had come back once, 6 years after leaving, asked for money to buy land. Ethan had given it without question, without asking why Samuel was using a different name, without saying the words that mattered. Come home. I'm sorry. Please. He'd written the loan in the ledger and watched his brother ride away and told himself money could speak for what pride wouldn't let him say. It hadn't been enough. Nothing had been enough. The ledger was still on the desk. Ethan opened it to that page and the wildflower fell out, pressed and brown, fragile enough to crumble at a touch. Sarah had put it there 2 months before she died, before fever took her and the baby neither of them would hold. She'd looked at him with bright eyes and said things that made no sense at the time. You'll be a father again. You'll know by the wildflowers. He'd thought she was delirious. Now he understood. His hands shook. His chest hurt like something was breaking open inside, pressure, building for 3 years, finally finding release. And for the first time since Sarah's funeral, Ethan Mercer cried, not quiet, not dignified, the kind of crying that came from somewhere deep and unfinished. For his brother, for 15 years of silence, for a 7-year-old girl who'd stumbled through a blizzard not knowing she was coming home. He sat there as the sun rose, as tears dried in salt tracks on his face, as the cold ash in the fireplace stopped smoking and went gray. Footsteps in the hall, Elena's voice soft and worried. Mr. Mercer. He couldn't answer, throat closed around words that wouldn't form. She came closer, saw his face in the morning light, crossed herself. Dios mío, what happened? She's my niece, his voice cracked on the words. My brother's child. And I didn't know, didn't find out till he was already dead. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd survived her own losses, who knew grief was a language with no good translations. She's here now. That's what matters. A cry from upstairs graced nightmare, sharp and frightened. Ethan stood, wiped his face with rough hands, started toward the stairs. She was sitting up when he reached her, eyes wide and dark in the dawn light, body rigid with whatever her sleeping mind had conjured. She grabbed his hand, and when he sat down beside her, I had a dream. Uncle Raymond was in it. He kept saying the land, over and over. Her fingers dug into his palm, hard enough to hurt. Uncle wants the land, he told Papa once. I heard them fighting before Papa died. Uncle said Papa's land should be his. Said Papa stole it. Ethan went cold, pieces clicking into place, the wagon accident, the brakes that failed, the executor appointed before the funeral, a man who talked about family while stealing from orphans. When was this? Week before the wagon. Her voice was small, flat, the tone of a child reporting facts she didn't fully understand but knew were important. Week before Papa died. Dawn came different after that, still cold, but without the brutal edge that had characterized December. Ethan stood in the barn doorway at 5:30, watching ice crack on the water trough. Sharp little pops that meant winter was breaking its grip. Spring trying to assert itself despite calendar dates that said February was still 2 weeks away. Grace appeared beside him, dressed in borrowed boys' clothes, pants and shirt Elena had found in a trunk, somewhere ranch hand clothes from years back, sleeves rolled up 3 times. You said I could learn. Ethan nodded, throat still tight from the night's revelations, but forcing himself into routine because routine was how people survived when the ground beneath them shifted. Dawn count, every morning, you gotta know your herd. He saddled 2 horses, put her on the gentle mare, showed her how to hold the reins not too tight, because that made a horse fight the bit, not too loose, because that meant you'd lost control when control mattered. They rode out into the half-light, breath steaming white, and the cattle were scattered across the winter pasture like dark shapes against gray snow. 100 head, give or take. Ethan stopped at the rise and just sat there listening to the sounds that told him more than any head count could. The low bellows, the soft grunts, the shuffle of hooves in snow, the particular rhythm of animals waking up. What are we doing? Grace's voice was quiet, curious rather than impatient. Hearing them, each cow's got a sound. You learn to read it. The herd lowed and shifted, and Ethan pointed to a big red cow near the fence. That one there. Hear how she's moaning low. That's discomfort. Got a calf coming soon. Couple weeks, maybe. Grace leaned forward in her saddle, and he saw her face change, the wariness giving way to concentration, the fear that had been her constant companion starting to loosen its grip as she found something to focus on besides survival. And that one, she pointed to a smaller cow apart from the herd, and Ethan felt something shift in his chest because she'd asked the right question, had already learned that animals on the periphery deserved attention. What do you hear? Her head tilted, listening with the intensity of someone who'd learned that missing details could mean consequences. It sounds wrong, like hiccups. Ethan turned to look at her, then at the cow, then rode over slow. Diego was already there, checking the animal with experienced hands. Bloat, caught it just in time. The ranch hand looked up, grinned at Grace. She got the ear for it, boss. The sun was rising now, gold light on white snow, and the air smelled of hay and manure and cold and coffee from Diego's thermos. Leather creaked as Ethan shifted in his saddle reins, cold in his hands despite his gloves. You did good. Grace sat up straighter, just a little, but enough to see, first time since she'd arrived, that she looked like something other than a frightened animal waiting for the next blow. Can I come tomorrow every morning you want? They rode back as the ranch woke up, smoke from the bunkhouse horses nickering in the barn, frozen grass crunching under hooves with a sound like walking on broken glass. Inside, Elena had breakfast, waiting eggs and bacon and fresh bread, and Grace ate like she'd forgotten food could taste good, like meals were something to be savored rather than endured. Ethan watched her and thought about belt buckles and cigar burns, and a man who'd do that to his own brother's child, who'd stand in church talking about family while stealing everything a dead man had left behind. Father Sullivan came after lunch, hat in hand, looking older than he had on Sunday. The winter light through the windows made him seem almost translucent, as if the effort of maintaining neutrality had worn him thin. I owe you an apology. Ethan poured coffee, sick cups on the table, and they sat in the front room where dust motes drifted through weak sunlight. The priest's hands shook slightly when he reached for his cup, age or cold or guilt, hard to tell which. I stood silent when Raymond spoke. That was cowardice dressed as neutrality. You're here now. Yes. And I brought an idea. Sullivan pulled papers from his coat, parish, records, baptisms, marriages, burials, the careful documentation that churches kept because civil authorities couldn't be trusted to remember who people were or where they came from. If we can prove Samuel Pritchard was Samuel Mercer, prove your kin adoption becomes family reunification. Much stronger legal ground. Ethan leaned forward, hope flickering despite 3 decades of learning not to trust easy solutions. Church records burned in '81. Local records, yes. But the diocese keeps copies in San Francisco. I wrote this morning, asked them to search. How long? 4 weeks, maybe less if the Archbishop prioritizes it. Sullivan's face was grim, the expression of a man delivering news that wasn't quite good enough. You've got 3 weeks till the hearing. The coffee sat steaming between them. Neither man touching it now. Outside, Grace's voice drifted through the window. She was building something in the snow with Elena. A snowman. Maybe the sound of her laughter strange and new. a thing he'd never heard before and now couldn't imagine living without. What if Raymond's already forged records? Then we pray the diocese archives are honest, and we pray harder that Judge Harrison values truth over paperwork. The priest's rosary clicked as he shifted in his chair, beads rattling soft against wood. But Ethan, you need to understand, even if we prove kinship, Raymond can still argue bachelor unsuitability. He's got money, he's got influence, he's got the law structured in his favor. So what do I have? Sullivan looked toward the window, toward the sound of Grace laughing. You have the fact that she's still alive, still eating, still learning to smile again. He turned back and his eyes were harder than Ethan had ever seen them, the shepherd's compassion giving way to something sharper. Sometimes that matters more than law. Sometimes. Ethan's hands curled around the coffee cup, heat burning his palms, but he didn't let go. Welcome the pain as anchor against the tide of uncertainty. I need more than sometimes. I know. That's why I'm searching. That's why Rosa Chin came to me yesterday, said she'd testify about the marks she saw. That's why Henry Cooper told his wife he'd stand witness even if Raymond calls his loan. Sullivan stood, put his hat back on, and something in his posture said the conversation had shifted from pastoral care to strategy. You're not alone in this, but you need to move fast, and you need to be ready for Raymond to fight dirty. He already is. Then fight dirtier. The priest's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, the tone of a man who'd read too many confessions from men who waited too long to act. That child deserves better than what the law is about to give her. Sometimes righteous men have to bend rules to serve justice. I'm saying that as a priest who's heard what happens when good people stay quiet. He left, door closing soft. Ethan sat alone with coffee gone cold, 3 weeks on the calendar, and a niece who didn't know yet that her uncle was stealing her inheritance, one forged document at a time, who didn't know that the man who'd saved her from the blizzard was her father's brother, who didn't know that family could be something other than violence and theft and lies. Through the window, Grace called out, "Mr. Mercer, come see." He stood, walked outside. She'd built a snowman, lopsided, smiling stack, arms and rocks for eyes, Elena's old scarf wrapped around its neck. "You like it, I do. Can we build one every winter?" The question hung in the cold air, simple and impossible to answer without lying or breaking her heart. Winter implied, years implied, permanence, implied a future he couldn't promise when the law said otherwise. "We'll try." It was the best he could offer, and it wasn't enough, but she smiled anyway because she'd learned to take what she could get and be grateful for scraps that others called starvation. That night, while Grace slept and Elena retired to her room and the house settled into the creaks and sighs of old wood, adjusting to temperature, Ethan went to the attic. He'd been avoiding it for 3 years. Too many memories packed into boxes, too much of Sarah still present in the careful way she'd labeled everything, her handwriting on dusty cardboard, declaring contents that no longer mattered to anyone but ghosts. But Samuel's things were up here, too packed away after the fight, after the leaving stored, because throwing them out felt too final, and keeping them in sight hurt too much. Ethan found the trunk in the back corner, label faded but still readable, SM, 1870. Inside, clothes that smelled of cedar and thyme, a harmonica that caught the lamplight, a sketch pad with drawings Samuel had done in charcoal landscapes, mostly mountains and valleys, rendered with the careful attention of someone who saw beauty in ordinary things. And one sketch that stopped Ethan's breathing by 2 boys ages 15 and 20, standing in front of the ranch gate with arms around each other, faces young and unaware that love wasn't enough to survive their father's will. Footsteps on the attic stairs, soft, hesitant, the particular rhythm of someone who wasn't sure they were allowed. Grace appeared in the lamplight, wearing her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, eyes huge in the shadows. Couldn't sleep. Her voice was barely audible. Me neither. She came closer, saw the open trunk, the sketch pad in Ethan's hands. "Who is this boy?" Her finger traced the drawing, and Ethan's voice came out rough with accumulated grief. "That's my little brother, Samuel." Grace leaned closer, studying the handwriting at the bottom, Samuel's signature, the date, the careful notation that this was home. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight no 7-year-old should have to bear. "He looks like Papa. Papa had harmonica like this." The world narrowed to this moment, attic dust floating in lamplight, a child's realization dawning, the truth that had hidden in plain sight finally stepping into view. Is Papa your brother? Ethan knelt, put himself at eye level, saw his brother's features echoed in this small face, the shape of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the way grief had carved lines that shouldn't exist yet. Yes, your papa was my brother. You're my niece, Grace. She processed this intelligence working behind those ancient eyes, fitting pieces together in ways that explained things she'd sensed but couldn't name. Why didn't you know me? Your papa and I, we fought a long time ago. I was proud and stupid and he left. Changed his name. I didn't know he had you. Didn't know anything until Doc Hayes told me 3 days ago. Did you love him? The question was direct, unflinching, the kind children asked when they'd learned that adults lied about important things and truth had to be extracted like splinters. Yeah, I did. Still do. Grace was quiet, and in the silence Ethan heard the clock downstairs marking time, heard wind outside pushing against shutters, heard his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Then she moved forward, wrapped thin arms around his neck, and held on with the desperate strength of someone who'd lost too much and couldn't afford to lose again. Papa used to say family is who shows up. Uncle Raymond never showed up. You did. It was the first time she'd hugged him, first time she'd chosen closeness over caution, and Ethan held her while the lamp burned low and the attic settled deeper into cold, and something in his chest loosened that had been clenched tight for 15 years. The next 10 days moved with the strange compression of time when deadlines loomed too fast and too slow simultaneously each day, both endless and insufficient. Ethan and Grace fell into routines that felt ancient, despite being new dawn counts, ranch work evenings at the desk, learning numbers and reading. She absorbed everything with the hunger of someone who'd been starved for attention, for knowledge, for the simple act of being seen as something other than burden or property. Diego brought news on January 12th. Raymond had filed a motion for immediate custody, citing unsafe conditions and inappropriate environment. Marshal Harding delivered the papers personally, face apologetic, but hands steady as he gave Ethan the summons. He's escalating, Harding's voice was quiet, trying to force your hand before the hearing. What's his play? Make you look desperate, make you react, then use that reaction to prove you're unstable. Ethan looked at the paper's legal language that turned ordinary life into evidence of unfitness, that painted his solitude as isolation and his grief as instability and his love for his niece as inappropriate attachment. I won't give him the satisfaction. Good, because that's what he's counting on, that you'll do something stupid he can use in court. The marshal paused at the door, voice dropping lower. Off the record, Rosa Chin's got testimony that'll hurt him. So does Cooper. And there's talk Margaret Foster's been keeping records. Raymond's got enemies he doesn't know about yet. January 15th brought sleet mixed with rain, the kind of weather that made the world feel hostile and temporary, as if spring was reconsidering whether Montana deserved its attention. Grace woke screaming from another nightmare, and when Ethan ran to her room, she grabbed his hands and spoke with the feverish intensity of someone remembering something vital. Papa hid papers in the well. Before Uncle came, before the wagon, Papa said if something happens, the truth's in the well. Ethan's blood went cold. What papers? The will, the deed, Papa's real deed, not the one Uncle showed the judge. Her teeth were chattering now, body shaking with more than cold. Uncle Raymond cut the brake cable. I heard him tell someone, heard him say accidents happen on mountain roads. Ethan held her while Elena brought tea and blankets, while the trembling subsided and exhaustion pulled her back towards sleep. But the words stayed with him. Papa hid papers in the well, and at midnight he saddled his horse and rode for Samuel's homestead with the Diego and Rosa Chin as witnesses, because this wasn't something he could do alone, wasn't something that could be done without people willing to testify they'd seen what he found. The homestead sat 5 miles east, what was left of it. Charred timbers scorched orchard apple trees like black grave markers against the gray sky. The sleet had stopped, but the temperature hovered just above freezing, everything slick with ice, and the stone well stood intact among the ruins like a monument to survival. You sure about this? Diego's voice carried doubt and loyalty in equal measure. No. Ethan tied rope to his saddle horn, looped it around his waist. But I'm doing it anyway. The descent was 15 feet of slick stone walls and darkness relieved only by Diego's lantern lowered beside him. Water at the bottom, shallow but freezing, soaking through his boots and pants almost instantly. His hands felt along the stones, searching for gaps for anything that shouldn't be there, and found it halfway down on the north side, a loose stone that moved when he pushed. Behind it, a metal box waterproof, rusted at the seams but intact. Got it. His voice echoed up, and Diego hauled him hand over hand until he emerged into air that felt warm by comparison despite the ice. They opened the box right there in the ruins by lantern light in the sleet because waiting felt like tempting fate. Inside, papers wrapped in oilcloth, a land deed in Samuel's real name, a will that named Ethan as guardian, a wedding photograph showing a young man who looked like Ethan had looked at 25, and pressed between the pages wildflowers, the same kind Sarah had pressed, the same kind Grace had picked, without knowing why. Ethan pulled out the photograph, held it close to the lantern, and saw his brother holding a baby girl, saw the love in Samuel's face that transcended 15 years of silence and pride and regret. Diego crossed himself. Dios mío. Rosa stepped forward, touched the will with gentle fingers. This is what he's been hiding. This is why he killed your brother. The will was clear, witnessed, and notarized, dated 2 weeks before Samuel's death. In the event of my death, guardianship of my daughter Grace, May Brennan shall pass to my brother Ethan Mercer, provided he proves himself worthy. The last line made Ethan's throat close. Blood doesn't make family. Choice does. If he chooses her, he's chosen right. Samuel had forgiven him, had believed in him, had given him one last chance to do what he should have done 15 years ago. Boss, Diego's voice was soft. We got what we need. Yeah, Ethan's voice was rough. We got it. They rode home through darkness with the tin box secured in Ethan's saddlebag, proof that Raymond had lied, that Samuel had known that blood and choice could be the same thing if a man was brave enough to claim both. 9 days left till the hearing. And finally, Ethan had something stronger than Raymond's forged papers. He had his brother's last words, and they were forgiveness wrapped in hope, wrapped in the terrible faith that love might survive even when everything else failed. February 13th arrived with the kind of clarity that felt like mockery. Sky so blue it hurt to look at, sun bright on snow. The sort of day that promised spring when winter still had teeth. Ethan stood at his bedroom window watching Grace and Diego's children build snow forts in the yard, their laughter carrying across the frozen ground like bells. Tomorrow the hearing would decide whether those sounds would continue or whether silence would reclaim the house the way it had for 3 years before she'd stumbled through the blizzard. He couldn't eat breakfast. Elena had made eggs and bacon and fresh bread, but the smell turned his stomach, and he pushed the plate away after 2 bites. The tin box from Samuel's well sat on his desk, contents spread out, baptism records from San Francisco that had arrived yesterday proving Grace May Brennan was Samuel Brennan's daughter, the will naming Ethan as guardian, the land deed in Samuel's real name, Margaret Foster's ledger copies showing 12 years of embezzlement, Rosa Chin's sworn statement about the scars, Dirk Hayes' medical affidavit written 3 days before he died, his signature shaky but legible, evidence stacked like ammunition, and Ethan had no idea if it would be enough. Grace appeared in the doorway still wearing her nightgown, though it was past 9, her hair uncombed, face pale. I had another dream. Her voice was small, and Ethan crossed the room, knelt in front of her, took her cold hands in his. Tell me. We were in the courtroom. The judge said I had to go back. Uncle Raymond was smiling. And you just stood there. You didn't fight. Her eyes filled, and she blinked hard, trying to force the tears back the way children did when they'd learned crying brought consequences. What if that's what happens? What if you can't stop it? Ethan's throat closed around the easy lies adults told children to make fear manageable. He could have said it would be fine, that everything would work out, that justice prevailed, and bad men got what they deserved. But Grace had lived through too much to believe in fairy tales, and lying to her now would be the cruelest thing he could do. Listen to me. He waited until her eyes met his. Tomorrow I'm going to fight for you with everything I have. Every piece of paper, every witness, every word I know how to say. And if the judge rules against us, I'll appeal. I'll take it to the territorial court to Washington if I have to. I'll fight till there's nothing left to fight with. But what if you can't win? The question hung between them, and Ethan heard what she wasn't asking. What if he abandoned her the way everyone else had? What if his promises meant nothing when measured against the law? What if she wasn't worth the trouble? Then we'll figure it out together, because you're not just my niece, you're my daughter. and I don't give up on family. Grace was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that broke his heart. Can I call you something instead of Mr. Mercer? What feels right, Papa Ethan? The words landed soft but carved themselves into his chest with the permanence of scars. He pulled her into a hug, felt her thin arms wrap around his neck, and thought about Samuel doing the same thing, holding the same child, promising safety. He couldn't guarantee loving her, despite knowing the world was built to take things away. Papa Ethan. He set it back, testing the shape of it, finding it fit better than anything had in 3 years. Yeah, that works. The courthouse filled early. By 7:30, an hour before the hearing, people lined the hallway, some curious, some genuinely concerned, most there, because spectacle was entertainment, and Coldwater didn't offer much else in February. Ethan arrived at 7:45 with Grace beside him, Elena and Diego behind, and the crowd parted with the careful neutrality of people who hadn't decided which side of history they wanted to be on. Raymond was already inside, sitting at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a slick man from Helena named Dalton, who wore expensive suits and had a reputation for winning custody cases through intimidation rather than evidence. Raymond looked confident, gold watch chain, catching the morning light face arranged in the expression of a man who'd already counted his winnings. When Raymond's eyes found Grace, something flickered across his face, not quite recognition, not quite regret, something colder that made Ethan's hands curl into fists. Grace pressed closer to Ethan's side, and he put his hand on her shoulder, anchor against the tide of fear that threatened to pull her under. Judge Harrison entered at 8 sharp 70 years of territorial law etched into his weathered face. The courtroom went silent, that particular quality of silence that meant everyone understood what was at stake, that lives were about to be weighed on scales that didn't always measure fairly. We're here on the matter of guardianship for Grace May Pritchard, minor's child. Harrison's voice carried without effort, decades of commanding courtrooms making projection unnecessary. Mr. Blackwood, you're the petitioner. Make your case. Raymond stood, papers rustling as he pulled out his prepared statement. His voice was smooth practice, the tone of a man who'd spent years selling trust. Your Honor, this is a matter of propriety and legal fitness. My niece, orphaned tragically last June, requires proper family care. Mr. Mercer's temporary shelter was kind, but kindness doesn't equal qualification. He paced, measured, every word rehearsed. Mr. Mercer is 52, unmarried, lives in isolation, has no experience raising children, no wife to provide maternal care, no family structure to support a young girl's development. Raymond gestured to his papers like they were sacred texts. I present testimony suggesting the child works before dawn, misses educational opportunities, is kept from proper social interaction. Furthermore, I am her blood uncle, executor of her father's estate. The law favors family placement. I have the means, the moral fitness, and the legal standing to raise this child properly. He sat down, and the courtroom murmured approval or doubt, impossible to tell which. Ethan's lawyer stood, young public defender, whose suit didn't quite fit, but whose eyes were sharp. Your Honor, may I present evidence? Harrison nodded, and the lawyer pulled out Rosa Chin's sworn statement, read it clear and careful. Belt buckle marks, cigar burns, a 7-year-old coming to a seamstress shop with injuries she called accidents. Rosa stood when called, walked to the witness chair with her spine straight, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd survived worse and refused to be silent. I seen the marks myself. I was indentured once, 14 years old. A man burned me for spilling tea. She showed her wrist, the old brand scar white against her skin, and the courtroom went quieter. I know what cruelty looks like. I seen it on that child before Mr. Mercer took her in. Raymond's lawyer objected, hearsay unverified, but Rosa's next words cut through the procedural nonsense. I got eyes. That ain't hearsay. Harrison made a note, face giving nothing away. Continue, Doctor. Hayes's affidavit came next, read aloud because he died 3 weeks earlier. His final act of conscience entered into the record posthumously. The words were clinical. Pneumonia, fever, malnutrition, bruising consistent with repeated physical punishment. But underneath the medical language was an old man's guilt, transformed into testimony. Silence finally broken when breaking mattered most. Henry Cooper took the stand, after his hands shaking slightly, but his voice steady. I knew Grace's mother before the fire. When Grace came to my store with Mr. Mercer, she was smiling, asking questions, healthy. I'd never seen her like that when she lived with Mr. Blackwood. He paused, and everyone could see the calculation he was making, the $400 Raymond held over him, the threat of losing his store, the choice between safety and truth. Raymond holds a note on my store, due next month. He threatened to call it if I testified. But my wife and I agreed some debts matter more than others. The courtroom shifted not much, but enough 5 or 6 people who'd been leaning toward Raymond's narrative, now sitting straighter, reconsidering. Then Margaret Foster took the stand, and the room went completely silent because everyone knew what this meant. Raymond's secretary for 12 years, the woman who'd typed his letters and filed his documents and kept his secrets, was about to burn everything down. Her hands trembled as she placed the ledger copies on the rail, but her voice was steady. Raymond Blackwood embezzled from 6 orphaned estates over 8 years, total $4,200. He appointed himself executor, forged debt documents, liquidated assets, pocketed the money. She looked directly at Raymond when she said it, and for the first time his mask slipped just a flicker, just enough to see the man underneath the careful construction. Samuel Pritchard's estate land, worth $2,400, cash of $600. Raymond claims Samuel owed him $2,800 through forged promissory notes. The land sold to Raymond for $1. The cash disappeared. Margaret pulled out the train ticket, held it up so everyone could see. San Francisco, departure February 15th. Tomorrow. He's planning to flee regardless of this hearing's outcome. The courtroom erupted, and Harrison's gavel came down hard, 3 sharp cracks that demanded order. Raymond's face had gone pale, his hand reaching for his pocket watch in the automatic gesture of a man seeking comfort from familiar objects when the world tilted wrong. The stable boy testified, next 16, and terrified but determined, saw Raymond by Samuel's wagon the night before the accident, saw the knife, took $5 to forget. The brake cable was presented as evidence, the clean cut visible even to untrained eyes, and the blacksmith's affidavit confirmed what everyone was starting to understand: Samuel Brennan hadn't died in an accident. Then Harrison called Grace forward, and the courtroom went quiet in a different way. The silence of people who knew they were about to hear things that would make them complicit in either salvation or damnation, depending on what they did next. Grace walked to the front in her blue calico dress, and she looked so small standing before the judge's bench that Ethan had to force himself to stay seated to trust that she was strong enough to do this. "Did your Uncle Raymond hurt you?" Harrison's voice was gentle, and Grace's response came out flat, rehearsed, the tone of someone reciting facts they'd had to learn by heart, because forgetting meant worse consequences. "Yes, sir. Hal belt when I was too slow with chores. Cigar burns when I talk back. Locked in the root cellar overnight when I cried for Papa after he died. He said crying was weakness, said Papa left me because I cost too much to feed." Somewhere in the courtroom, a woman made a soft sound, grief or outrage or both, and Harrison's expression remained neutral, but his hand tightened on the gavel. "Did he ever threaten you?" "Yes. Said if I told about Papa's papers about the real will, I'd go where Mama went. Mama died in a fire." I knew what he meant. "And Mr. Mercer? Has he hurt you?" "Oh, sir. What does he do?" Grace looked back at Ethan, and something in her face softened. "He teaches me things. Ranch work, numbers, listening to the cattle. He doesn't yell when I get it wrong. He just shows me again." Her voice wavered. "He makes me feel like I'm not too expensive to keep." The courtroom was crying now, not everyone but enough. Mrs. Hartwell wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, and even Harrison's expression flickered before settling back into judicial neutrality. "You can sit down, child." Grace walked back, and Ethan stood before she reached him, walked to the front because his lawyer was gesturing. And this was the moment everything either worked or didn't. He pulled the pressed wildflower from his vest pocket, brown and fragile and impossibly important. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years of grief and 15 years of regret in one moment of choice that had rewritten everything. "Your Honor, I need to say something that's not in any document." Harrison nodded, and Ethan held the flower up where light from the windows could catch it. "My wife died 3 years ago. Childbirth. Baby didn't make it. Before she passed, she looked at me and said, I'd be a father again, that I'd know by the wildflowers." He looked at Grace, saw his brother's eyes staring back. "I thought she was delirious. But this child, my brother's child, who I didn't even know existed, she picked this same flower. Didn't know what it meant. Didn't know my wife used to press these exact ones." His hands shook and the flower trembled. I failed my brother, 15 years of pride and silence. He died thinking I didn't want him thinking I chose land over family. I can't fix that. Can't bring him back. Can't tell him I'm sorry. He set the flower on Harrison's bench with the care of a man handling something holy. But I can choose his daughter, can raise her right, can show her that family isn't just blood or paperwork. It's who you'd ride through a blizzard for, who you'd fight a whole town for, who you choose every morning, even when choosing costs everything. The flower rested on the dark wood, small and brown and somehow containing everything that mattered. My wife was right. I'm a father again, and I know it by the wildflowers. I'm asking this court to let me keep choosing. Let me be what my brother needed me to be 15 years ago. He walked back to his seat, and Grace's hand found his immediately held tight, while the courtroom processed what they just heard, not a legal argument, but a confession, not evidence, but truth. Harrison looked at Raymond, and his voice had gone cold. Mr. Blackwood, were you aware Samuel Pritchard was born? Samuel Brennan? Raymond hesitated, calculation visible behind his eyes. The records were unclear. Did you know or not? Yes. So you knowingly hid from this court that Grace has a blood uncle. Raymond tried to recover, but the ground was crumbling. Samuel changed his name. He abandoned his family. I was protecting Harrison, held up Margaret's ledgers. You forged debt documents. You embezzled from 6 orphaned estates. You have a train ticket to flee tomorrow. Marshal Harding. The marshal stepped forward, and Raymond stood face going from pale to red as he understood what was happening. Arrest Raymond Blackwood. Charges: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, child endangerment, and suspicion of murder in the death of Samuel Brennan. The handcuffs clicked metal on metal, the sound ringing through the courthouse like a bell marking the end of something. Raymond tried to maintain dignity as Harding led him toward the door, but he stumbled on the steps and his pocket watch fell from his coat, landed in the mud by the courthouse entrance. Henry Cooper bent down, picked it up, read the inscription aloud. Fortune favors the bold and the ruthless. He set it on the courthouse steps, left it there in the mud where it belonged. Harrison returned to the bench, and the courtroom held its breath. I've heard testimony from 8 witnesses. I've reviewed baptism records, wills, medical reports, financial documents, and physical evidence of abuse and fraud. He paused, and in that pause, the entire world seemed to wait. The facts are clear. Grace May Brennan is the biological niece of Ethan Mercer. Her father, Samuel Brennan, explicitly named Mr. Mercer as guardian. Raymond Blackwood obtained custody through fraud and deception. Harrison's voice softened slightly. But beyond legality, I must consider the child's welfare. Family is not defined solely by blood or proximity. It's defined by who protects, who nurtures, who loves without condition. The gavel came down. I hereby grant full custody and adoption rights to Ethan Mercer. Grace May Brennan is now Grace May Mercer, legally and permanently. The courtroom erupted, and Grace ran to Ethan, and he lifted her while she wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "Papa Ethan," over and over, like a prayer finally answered. Sorry. 3 years later, spring came to Montana with the kind of certainty that made winter feel like a lie. The valley told itself to appreciate warmth. April of 1888, and the apple orchard at Samuel's rebuilt homestead was in full bloom. 15 trees heavy with white blossoms that drifted on the wind like snows opposite. Grace was 10 now, reading ranch ledgers with the same ease her father had shown, tallying cattle sales and feed costs with precision that made Ethan wonder if numbers really did tell stories when you knew how to listen. She sat at the desk, half his, half hers now, and when she looked up, her face had lost the ancient exhaustion that had characterized 7, had found something closer to childhood, even if true innocence was gone forever. Papa Ethan, Diego says the red cow's about to calf. Want to go check? Her voice carried excitement rather than fear, curiosity rather than wariness, and Ethan stood from his chair, body protesting slightly, because 55 came with aches 37 had never imagined. Lead the way. They rode out together in the dawn light, Grace confident in the saddle, now reading the herd by sound, the way he'd taught her. The valley had greened up fast this year. Winter's grip releasing early, and meadowlarks called from fence posts, while the cattle grazed peacefully across pastures that stretched toward mountains still capped with snow. The red cow was laboring near the creek, Diego, already there keeping watch, and Grace dismounted to observe, not too close because cows needed space, but close enough to learn to understand that birth was messy and difficult and miraculous when it worked. The calf came just after sunrise, wet and wobbly and alive, and Grace's face lit with the particular joy that came from witnessing beginning. The mother lowed soft, licking her baby clean, and Ethan saw Grace's expression shift, not quite tears, but something close emotion she was still learning to name. Makes you think about things. Her voice was quiet, and Ethan knew she was thinking about her own mother, about the birth that had killed Sarah, about how close she'd come to not existing. Yeah, it does. They rode back as the ranch woke up smoke from the bunkhouse chickens scratching in the yard. Elena calling that breakfast was ready. Inside the table was set for 7, Ethan and Grace Elena, and her daughter who'd come to help with the house, Diego and his 2 boys who worked the ranch now. Sunday dinner rotated between families, these days, 12 regulars, sometimes more. The house that had been silent for years now filled with voices and laughter and the sound of people who'd learned family was something you built rather than inherited. After breakfast, Grace asked if they could visit the homestead, and Ethan saddled horses again. Because the answer was always yes when she asked to see her father's land. The house they'd rebuilt stood solid, not big, not fancy, but weatherproof and well-made, held in trust until Grace turned 21. The apple orchard surrounded it, trees that had been saplings 3 years ago, now tall enough to bear fruit branches heavy with blossoms that would become apples come fall. Grace walked among them, touching bark with gentle fingers, and Ethan followed at a distance, giving her space to commune with ghosts only she could hear. She stopped at the oldest tree, the one they'd planted, first the one they'd dedicated to her mother, and stood there for a long moment before speaking. "You think Papa knows about us?" The question was impossible to answer with certainty, but Ethan tried anyway. "I think if there's anything after, if there's any way to see what happens to the people we love, then yeah, I think he knows, and I think he's glad." Grace nodded, accepting this, then knelt and placed something at the tree's base, wildflowers purple and yellow, the kind that grew everywhere now, that came back every year without asking permission. "These are for him, and Mama, and your Sarah, and the baby that didn't make it. So they know we remember." Ethan's throat closed and he knelt beside her, placing his own flowers, white ones, this time star-shaped blooms that Sarah had loved. They stayed there while wind moved through the orchard and blossoms fell like benediction. And somewhere nearby, a killdeer called the sound that meant spring had arrived to stay. The ride home was quiet, but the good kind of quiet, comfortable rather than empty. When they reached the ranch, Rosa Chin's buggy was in the yard, and Grace brightened because Rosa had become something like an aunt, someone who understood that survival created bonds as strong as blood. Inside, Rosa was showing Elena fabric samples for new curtains, but she turned when Grace entered and pulled a small package from her bag. "For you, early birthday present." Grace's birthday was still a month away, but she took the package with the careful reverence of someone who'd learned gifts were rare and precious. Inside was a dress, blue calico, like the one she'd worn to court, but this one fit perfectly, made specifically for her body rather than borrowed and altered. "Rosa, it's beautiful. Try it on. Let me see if the measurements were right." Grace disappeared upstairs, and when she came back down, she looked older somehow, growing into the person she'd become rather than away from the person she'd been. She twirled, once self-conscious but pleased, and Rosa's smile carried the satisfaction of work done well. "You look like someone who knows she belongs." Grace's expression shifted, and she crossed the room to hug Rosa with the fierceness of someone expressing things words couldn't carry. Elena joined them, and suddenly Ethan was watching 3 generations of survival learning to call themselves family, watching women who'd been broken by men's cruelty, choosing each other across boundaries of culture and history. Later, after Rosa left and Grace went to bed and Elena retired to her room, Ethan sat alone in his study. The ledger from 1878 was still on the shelf, and he pulled it down, open to the page where Samuel's handwriting recorded the $500 loan. The wildflower Sarah had pressed was gone, given to the judge 3 years ago, entered as evidence transformed from memory into instrument of justice. But he'd pressed new ones, dozens of them, in new ledgers that tracked different transactions. Grace's education fund, growing Rosa's seamstress business thriving on his investment, Henry Cooper's store note paid in full when Raymond's assets were liquidated, Margaret Foster's bookkeeping school funded through a trust that bore no name but everyone knew came from the quiet millionaire who'd learned that money mattered most when it served something larger than accumulation. Footsteps on the stairs, soft, hesitant. Grace appeared in her nightgown, hair, loose face uncertain in the lamplight. Can't sleep, too much thinking. Come here. She climbed into his lap even though she was getting too big for it, and he wrapped his arms around her while she settled against his chest. What are you thinking about everything? The trial, Uncle Raymond dying in prison, Doc Hayes and how he told you about Papa, the will in the well. How many things had to happen exactly right for us to end up here? She paused. It feels like magic, but scary magic, like it could all disappear. Ethan understood the survivor's fear that good things were temporary, that happiness was a trick the universe played before pulling it away. He'd lived with that fear for 3 years after Sarah died, had only started letting it go when Grace stumbled through the blizzard and gave him no choice except to hope. Not magic, just people choosing right when choosing was hard. Rosa choosing to testify even though it risked her business. Cooper choosing his conscience over his debts. Margaret choosing truth when lies were safer. Doc Hayes choosing confession when silence would have been easier. He tightened his arms around her. Your papa choosing to name me in his will even after 15 years of me being too proud to apologize. And you choosing to trust me when every adult in your life had taught you trust was dangerous. Grace was quiet processing, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. You think we'll be okay? Forever okay. Forever's a long time, but I think we'll be okay for tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and that's enough. She nodded against his chest, and they sat there while the lamp burned low and the house settled into night sounds, wood creaking wind outside, the distant sound of coyotes singing to the moon. Eventually her breathing evened out, and Ethan carried her upstairs, tucked her into bed, with the care of a man who'd learned that love was expressed through small, repeated actions, rather than grand gestures. Back in his study, he pulled out paper and pen, wrote words he'd never send because the recipient was 15 years dead, Samuel. I'm keeping my promise. I'm choosing her every day. I'm being the father you needed me to be, the brother I should have been. I'm teaching her that family is who shows up, who stays, who fights. And I'm learning it too. Learning that the best parts of you survived in her. That forgiveness is possible even when the person you need to forgive is yourself. Thank you for believing I was worthy. Thank you for giving me one more chance to get it right. He folded the letter, placed it in the ledger beside the pressed wildflowers, closed the book on a debt that was finally completely paid. Dawn came clear and cold, the kind of morning that made promises feel possible. Ethan stood in the barn doorway, watching the valley wake up, sun painting the mountains gold, meadowlarks calling their territories smoke, rising from chimneys across the ranch. Grace appeared beside him, right on time, dressed for the dawn, count in her work clothes, hair braided back, face expectant. Ready always. They rode out together into air that smelled of swimming and snowmelt and possibility, and the cattle greeted them with familiar lows, the herd healthy and calm and responding to the rhythms Grace had learned to read. She pointed out a cow showing early labor signs correctly identified, bloat in a yearling, before Diego spotted it, called out hoof rot that would have gone unnoticed by someone less observant. You're better at this than I was at your age. That's because I had a good teacher. The words landed soft but carved themselves deep validation that teaching and learning were reciprocal, that saving and being saved happened simultaneously. They sat on the rise watching the sun climb, and Grace's voice broke the companionable silence. Papa Ethan, yeah. If Papa Samuel could see us now, what do you think he'd say? Ethan considered this thought about his brother's face in the old photograph, about the will that said blood doesn't make family, choice does, about 15 years of silence that had somehow transmuted into this, a 10-year-old girl who knew how to read cattle by ear and balance ledgers and build snowmen and trust that tomorrow would come. I think he'd say we both chose right, that we're doing what family does, showing up, staying, loving each other even when it's hard. Grace nodded, satisfied, then pointed to the valley below where wildflowers were starting to bloom in patches of color against the greening grass, purple and yellow and white, the kind that came back every spring without fail. Look, Sarah's flowers, yeah, telling us it's time to start again. They rode down together as the sun rose higher and the valley filled with light, two silhouettes against the morning. A man who'd learned that redemption came through choosing love over pride, and a girl who'd learned that family was whoever fought through blizzards to bring you home. Behind them, the mountain stood eternal ahead. The valley opened into possibility, and beneath them, the land held stories of people who'd loved and lost and found each other anyway. The dust wouldn't settle on a man's conscience if he kept moving forward, and they kept moving every dawn, every cattle count, every moment they chose each other over easier paths. The wildflowers grew thick that year, carpeting the meadows, and when people asked what made them so abundant, Elena would smile and say nothing, but everyone who'd been in the courtroom 3 years ago understood. Some things couldn't be explained with botany or rainfall or soil composition. Some things grew because love had been planted deep enough to survive winter, because hope refused to die, even when circumstances demanded it, because family, real family, was the kind of magic that transformed cursed ground into gardens. And every spring, after when the wildflowers bloomed and Grace walked among them with her father at her side, they remembered the night everything changed, the blizzard that brought her home, the 6 words that saved them both. I'm sick. I can't walk. Can I stay one night? One night that became forever. One choice that rewrote history. One family built from the wreckage of 2 held together by wildflowers and will, and the stubborn insistence that love when chosen daily could outlast any winter.